This UCSD TV program is presented by University of California Television. Like what you learn? Visit our website or follow us on Facebook and Twitter to keep up with the latest programs. Also, make sure to check out and subscribe to our YouTube original channel, UCTV Prime, available only on YouTube.
So we are just kicking off the session that is titled Social Networks for Social Justice, The Power of Technology to Do Good, with Ron Brownstein interviewing Ben Rattray. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Thank you all for being here this morning. Ben Rattray is the founder and CEO of Change.org, which, like many institutions in our modern life, didn't exist 10 years ago and is now growing at a rapid pace. He is a graduate of Stanford University, the London School of Economics, and he has been listed in Time Magazine's, included in Time Magazine's 100 most influential people in the world in 2012, so congratulations on that, certainly. So let me start with this, before we kind of talk about some of the details about what you do. I think a lot of people in this room would not necessarily be fully aware of kind of the platform that you've created. Talk a little bit about why you created what you did and how it has evolved since you started it.
Yeah, great to be here. Thanks so much. So I initially actually wanted to be an investment banker, and I went to Stanford for that purpose in part. My senior year at Stanford, I go home, and one of my younger brothers comes out as gay. And he says, one of the most influential things in my life, he says, the thing that was most painful for him as a closeted young gay American wasn't people that were explicitly anti-gay, but people who refused to stand up and to speak out against them. And it was hugely influential. I was ashamed for one of the first times in a deep, deep way of my life and sort of reflected about what I wanted to do with my life. And so I went from the track of wanting to be an investment banker to wanting to get involved in social change. And after a number of years, going to London School of Economics, reading many books, experiencing power in Washington, started Change.org as a platform to organize around issues people care about. So we started this in 2007, and we systemically failed for about 3.5 years. And then over the past year and a half, things have taken off. We're growing by about 2 million new members a month, more than 20 million members around the world, and winning campaigns for change every day. And if I would identify one thing that is a differentiation between when we failed systemically and when now we're successful is specificity. It's that in social justice movements, historically, at least over certainly the past few decades, there's this inclination for big national or global movements and change. You want to stop global warming, you want to advance gay rights, you want to end global poverty. And while those are laudable aims, if you try to do them directly, as we try to build a platform for, there's not a lot of specific action you can take that's effective. And what we did, we changed, is starting with the sort of oldest tool in advocacy, petitions, to allow people to petition for very small, local, incremental change, and that's spreading like wildfire.
So just go back and explain a little bit. The tool that people use the site to do what? To encourage, to post petitions.
Yep.
And to encourage others to sign them?
Exactly. It's a very simple petition. People are shocked sometimes. It's just a petition site. Now, saturated in social media and with now the tools to take people who sign a petition and mobilize them as parts of movements. But these are very specific. It's literally 3 fields. What do you want to change? Who has the power to change it? And why should people join you? You start the petition, start spreading it through Facebook and Twitter. There's about 20,000 a month that are started, and many of them go viral.
You mentioned the inspiration, but where did the inspiration coalesce into the idea of petitions? How did you focus in on petitions as the way of trying to focus that desire?
Well, initial focus wasn't specifically petitions, but using the web to organize people around common objectives. And so the story is actually, it was in 2005, I was in DC disenchanted with my first experience in politics and
What
government.
were you doing?
I was doing sort of consulting, kind of in government consulting for education companies. Just had graduated, and I end up, you look at sort of this little website called thefacebook.com, 2005, very early, thefacebook.com. And you sort of see immediately the capacity for people to come together around personal interests, around photos, around friends. And I saw the same technology could be used to organize people around the issues they care about and solve one of the most fundamental problems in social organizing and social justice, which is collective action. It's a very historic structural dilemma where it's extremely expensive, both in time and resources, to organize people around common aims, and by virtue of that, you have citizen sort of aims and objectives are oftentimes less powerful than common special interests who can more effectively organize for their issues. And so that was kind of the genesis of the idea, but we built this superstructure of this massive tool set for people to organize around very large objectives. And it was only after many different experiences did we found that petitions, very specific incremental change, was the most effective way of starting to win campaigns. You know,
kind of the shift of the paradigm, I think someone's covered politics for a long time, that historically one of the greatest expenses in politics is finding people who agree with you. And that's what you spend a lot of money on. I think about how Common Cause was founded. Common Cause took out a full-page ad in the New York Times to raise enough money, ask people to send them checks, to raise enough money to do a direct mail campaign, which ultimately provided the seed money that created the organization. MoveOn.org, a generation later, the internet flips the paradigm where people who agree with you can find you instead of you finding them, prospecting for them. They can find you at essentially no cost, and something like MoveOn grows exponentially faster in the post-98 period than Common Cause was able to do in the first period. I mean, is that sort of the fundamental, I mean, is the twist here that people who agree with, in other words, if you had to start a petition and go out and prospect through or sift through the great mass of America and find the people who agree with you, prohibitively expensive, but the internet makes it possible to turn that around.
Yeah, it makes the cost of organizing trivial. You can actually, not just as an organization, but as an individual, mobilize hundreds of thousands of people in real time, which to your point would have been extremely, not just difficult, but really expensive to do.
Expensive.
And so if you look at the aggregate dollars you would have to raise, if you're, it's a campaign recently, one of my favorite campaigns just over the past few months related to the presidential election is there's 3 16-year-old girls in Montclair, New Jersey, and they're in a civics class, and they find out that there hasn't been a female moderator of a presidential debate in 20 years. Right? There's only one in history. And so they start a petition asking the Presidential Debate Commission to accept a female moderator. And over the next 2 weeks, they get 170,000 people to join. It's this massive social media outcry. They go and protest in front of the debate commission, get huge amounts of press on CNN and Fox News and whatnot, and ends up, after about a week, that the Presidential Debate Commission asks the first female moderator in the past 20 years to moderate. And if you had aggregated the expense that would be required, right, to actually pay for that kind of campaign in the media, it's millions of dollars. It's millions of dollars. And so what's exciting, I think, now is that can spawn all the time and from any individual.
Yeah, and in fact, on direct mail, 2% is considered a good return. So you can see kind of the difference. So would have been some of the, you mentioned that, there's the Bank of America, Verizon, would have been the most successful campaigns so far?
You know, the campaign that actually that inspired us initially to pivot from these very broad objectives around stopping global warming to very specific change was this incredible campaign about a year and a half ago. It was in South Africa. There's a huge global explosion now of campaigns on Change.org. And the story is there's a woman that was walking down the street in Cape Town, and she gets grabbed and thrown into a shack and raped and almost killed. And the reason is she's a lesbian woman, and the man was trying to turn her straight. It's an awful thing called corrective rape. And a good friend of hers sees this, had signed a petition around gay rights in Uganda, and she goes to an internet cafe, starts a petition asking the Minister of Justice of the country to take the issue seriously. And over the next week and a half, 180,000 people from 150 countries take action, embarrasses the government. It's a huge overall media exposure. And after about a month of campaigning, the government apologizes and Parliament passes a bill to have a task force investigate and stop the issue of corrective rape after entirely ignoring the issue before. It's an amazing demonstration of people power.
How about in the US? What have been the most resonant campaigns? What have had the biggest impact?
So the campaigns, one of the most, I think, most powerful campaigns from a sort of a public narrative perspective is the Trayvon Martin case. And so Trayvon Martin, 17-year-old African-American kid killed in Florida tragically. And for about 2 weeks after that incident, there's almost no media exposure at all. It's a private injustice. And as parents, we connect to them, they start a petition on the site, it goes massively viral, ends up being 2 million people join the campaign, spawns many different protests, becomes certainly more than just the petition. I think the importance isn't just the individual act of now arresting his killer, George Zimmerman, and prosecuting him, but the public narrative that results, the awareness about this as a tragic situation of young African Americans not being treated fairly in the justice system, or these stand your ground laws about being able to sort of almost with impunity be able to shoot somebody if they come at you in different states. So that's some of the really exciting stuff that we see. Isn't just the direct victories that happen, but the public narrative and shift in mindset that occurs because of them.
Well, we'll talk about that in a minute, but let me ask you, is there, and on Trayvon Martin, I mean, certainly the petition had an impact, but I do a starting point with Soledad O'Brien pretty regularly, and they were not waiting. I mean, they were in there pretty soon on that case as well. But what I want to ask you is, do you find a difference in the way that because you have a lot of petitions that are aimed at companies to do specific things, and obviously some of them have more political implications. Is there a difference in the response between business institutions and political institutions?
Yeah, there's a tragic difference, which is politicians are much less responsive to public pressure right now than companies. And part of the reason is it's easier to change your detergent than your congressman. And so the switching costs, I tell members of Congress this and they love it, the switching costs are just really easy and trivial for most brands. And most brands are in businesses of commodity marketplaces where that sort of public perception of what they do is the biggest value they have. And so if you start to attack that, or if people on Twitter and Facebook start to attack that, they're very sensitive. Many more staff that are dedicated to sort of observing the sentiments in social media and are much more responsive. Whereas politicians, as oftentimes happens, is a bit lagging in sort of in its application and engagement in social media for actual policy, not just pushing out content, but engaging with people.
But even from the point of view of companies, I can see how they can be responsive to a campaign about the attributes of a product, like Jamba Juice and whether they're using biodegradable cups. If you could imagine something like the Chick-fil-A controversy, where it's pretty easy to imagine tens of thousands of people mobilizing on your site saying, stop contributing to groups that promote or are hostile to gay rights. And Ralph Reed organizing tens of thousands of people to send them emails on the other side from the Faith and Freedom Coalition. I mean, does the capacity to organize dilute the inherent polarization in any way? I mean, or is it just kind of provides another battlefield in which it plays out?
I think what's most exciting that we see is there's so many battles that are not pitched partisan debates, that aren't 50-50 on a regular basis, that are these underlying things that aren't actually cultural battles, but still obscure and not changed. I'll give you an example. It's actually a bill that's about to pass in Congress where it used to be the case that it's legal for rental car companies to not return recalled cars. So they can have cars that are dangerous, they don't have to recall, and they got a enterprise, and Hertz got a loophole in the Department of Transportation bill, and that allowed them to do this. And in 2004, there were two girls, tragically 25 and 23, who rent a PT Cruiser and drive it down the road, and per the concerns of the recall, it flames out, hits a semi, and they both die. And their mom ends up having the civil lawsuit for the next 10 years or next 8 years and wins the civil lawsuit. But the law didn't change, still hadn't changed. And it was only after she starts a petition on the site, embarrasses Enterprise, gets more than 100,000 people to join, is going to be on the Today Show, that Enterprise retracts its position and changes the policy. And that's not controversial. There's so many underlying, in fact, an order of magnitude more than you see, because all you see are the ones that are the most pitched and partisan.
It's interesting. So as you say, you've kind of evolved from the big, broad, global to the more specific and local. But I've also seen you quoted as saying something to the effect, we want to move from moments to movements. So are you comfortable with where you are? And what you're basically saying is the more tangible, the more narrow, the bigger the impact you can have. Is that where you envision this in 5 years or 7 years? Or would you be disappointed if you're not kind of making the circle back to figuring out how to influence the bigger, broader issues?
Yeah, that's a great question. So if you look at kind of the trajectory of most social movements, most social justice movements, you end up almost always starting small. You wouldn't go in 1964 to LBJ in the context of no organizing and say you should really pass the Civil Rights Act. Right? 10 years before, you refused to walk to the back of a bus, and you sit at lunch counters, and you went incrementally from families to friends to towns to cities to country, and that's the kind of tool set we're trying to build that allows you to get a foothold with local change, and that aggregates across the country, goes from 1 victory to 10 to 100. I mean, one very small example is there's an attempted movement around ending plastic bags in America, right? By virtue of increasing the tax to internalize the third-party costs of plastic bags, and it's just almost impossible.
It succeeded in Bethesda, Maryland.
Yes, so it changes in individual cities. This is how it happens. And the way you win nationally is by winning locally. And there's this great case where a 13-year-old girl who has an 8th grade project about 4 months ago starts a campaign asking her own town to pass a plastic bags tax. And then the plastics industry, brilliant move, gets a state law passed in the state of Illinois to make it illegal to pass local plastic bags taxes. So she responds to petition the governor of the state to veto the bill. And after getting more than 100,000 people to join, huge media narrative, the governor calls her on her home phone line about a month ago, says, "I've seen your campaign, I've been inspired, I'm gonna veto the bill." And in response to that now, you have all these young girls that are starting campaigns around the country in their towns trying to pass plastic bags taxes. And so you don't win it with 1 victory, you win with hundreds of them, but you start with a single one.
And so does that, as you were describing it as kind of aggregating up, do you see a way to tackle some of the bigger issues that you would be concerned about? How does this, for example, translate into, say, climate change? Take one example. How would this platform ultimately, in your mind, 3 years from now, 5 years from now, President Obama wins a 2nd term, 2013, it's on the table. Can you influence debates like that?
Yeah, I think definitely so. I mean, first, we don't take official positions on policies, but I'll give you an example on climate change. I would bet that instead of having a very large national campaign around Congress as an entity, I mean, Congress doesn't make decisions, right? Members of Congress make decisions, and all politics is local. And so if instead of a very large campaign in the US around Congress, if you had 435 13-year-old girls and 435 districts who start local campaigns with incredible personal narratives around why it's important for their generation that we pass climate change, then you'd have a materially different public narrative. Another good example is around immigration. This is happening already, where there's a very, to your point, a very pitched, partisan, divisive 50-50 battle on immigration at a national level. But when you sort of look at the way that policy impacts real people's lives, you end up changing minds. And so we have these, on a regular basis, kids that will start petitions in defense of their friends who are going to be deported to countries they've never known. These are DREAM Act students. There's tens of thousands that graduate high school every year. It's a case where there's a kid who is brought into the country at age 2 from Honduras. His dad dies. His mom's in a mental asylum. Ends up being the case that he's hugely successful, and only when he goes to pay a parking ticket does he find out right before going to college that he's not documented, didn't even know, and he's going to be deported to a country he's never known, doesn't speak English or doesn't speak Spanish because his parents wanted him to be very American. When you ask people that question, right, should that person be deported, you have a very different sentiment than about illegal immigrants, broadly speaking. It's the aggregation of all those different campaigns that both intrinsically fight sort of the injustice that might occur for those individual stories and instrumentally build broader movements for bigger national change.
You know, you mentioned that many of the causes are kind of non-ideological, but certainly to the extent they are ideological, it kind of starts in the center, goes to the left, I think, on the side in terms of what have been the biggest priorities. Is there a conservative analog to this, or do you expect one?
We see more and more conservative campaigns on a regular basis. In fact, what's funny is a lot of the campaigns around corporate accountability are started by conservatives. We don't know, and we engage with petition creators on a regular basis when they start viral petitions. It's a case where in Target, the company Target ends up about a week before Thanksgiving last year, they announced that all their workers, the first time, are going to have to work on Thanksgiving. And there's a worker who is in Kansas and starts a petition, gets 150,000 people to join, condemning Target's actions, which are anti-family, seem to be. And this is a Ron Paul supporter who's just like, this just seems wrong. And there's so many campaigns, this campaign around enterprise rent-a-car that doesn't have to recall cars because of a loophole in a transportation bill just seems wrong. And so you really have these kind of transpartisan campaigns that don't hit a specific
What about
ideology.
like purely conservative. For example, like if someone wanted to go on and start a petition to boycott Amazon because Jeff Bezos supported the gay marriage amendment in Washington State. If someone wanted to do that, post a petition to boycott Amazon, could they do it on the site?
Oh, absolutely. It may have happened already. There's 20,000 campaigns launched every single month. It's sort of like YouTube. It's totally an open platform. Anyone, anywhere can start a campaign. I mean, most of these campaigns are about changing things, right? About changing the status quo. And so it tends toward things that, are about social justice. But it's certainly the case that, in the case of Chick-fil-A. It's the case of Chick-fil-A you referenced, how it's a number of campaigns on the site asking for universities in particular to revoke Chick-fil-A's right to sell on campus because they fund anti-gay movements. You had campaigns on the site that were the opposite, that were asking sort of different universities to affirm the free speech rights of Chick-fil-A. But what you find is campaigns that are building people up, campaigns that seem just and seem to people resonant with the kind of the moral values they have, just seem right, tend to be more sort of viral. And so things that seem to be, frankly, in some cases, sort of regressive in many people's perspective, tend not to be shared as virally and don't take off as much.
Well, it's interesting because, I mean, thinking about how these two things that are happening simultaneously, certainly we are more networked and connected than ever, and the ability of an individual to, as you say, communicate. Almost, you have mass communication without the mass media available now almost to individuals. So we are more connected than ever. On the other hand, politically, we are as polarized as ever. Highest level of party line voting in Congress since the late 19th century. Entirely possible that in this election, Barack Obama will win 80% of non-white votes and only 40% of whites. The gap between the way presidents are viewed by voters, the opposite party, the widest it's ever been, and getting worse each president, not just one, from Clinton to Bush to Obama, a wider gap. Do you think the technology, the networking technology, is a force that is knitting together and bridging our differences, or one that is exacerbating and polarizing our differences?
Well, it certainly has a capacity for either. There's this sort of concern of the filter bubble, right? That as you have increasing networks around single sort of friend groups, you're going to have filtering out all the things you don't believe and filtering in only those things that reaffirm your prejudices. That's one trend. The other trend that we're most excited about is transcending politics through storytelling. And so things that are really divisive, I mentioned around immigration, that seem not building people up, but actually dividing people against each other. When you hear about how policies impact real people's lives, in particular in local contexts, you tend to have a lot more solidarity, a much greater sense of mutual support. And so what we're excited about isn't focused so much on the national debates, the partisan pitched battles that do divide people on a regular basis, but what's happening locally in real people's communities on a daily basis. There tends to be a lot more agreement on local change than there is on national change.
So you feel that at the local level, this transcends difference?
At the local level, there are things that are much more personal. People saving a local park or changing, there's a teacher that's fired for being gay, and you know the teacher. There's a great example there where there's a huge pitched partisan battle around the Employment Non-Discrimination Act, which is effectively giving non-discrimination policy for gay and lesbian Americans. In 29 states in the country, you can be fired for being gay. It's very controversial at a national level. And then there's a campaign about a year ago where there's a teacher outside of Oregon who ends up being fired for being gay. And parents are outraged, and they start a campaign, and thousands join, and hundreds go protest, and they end up, superintendent apologizes and gives the teacher his job back. What was notable was the overwhelming public support, even of those people. When you asked in the abstract whether they'd support sort of special policies for gay and lesbian Americans, wouldn't have supported them. When you look at the particulars in their community, there's much more sense of shared perspective and support.
So how do you kind of, and not that you are responsible for balancing these two, but as you kind of look at the centrifugal and the centripetal forces that are at work here, which do you think in the long run, are we in the long run, or are we on a trajectory to become more united or more divided as a society with these tools?
I think absolutely more united. And it's a sense of solidarity, of seeing the kind of intimate insight into the way other people think, other people experience life, and recognizing that it's not about policies in the abstract. It's about how things go in individual experiences. And in that sense of solidarity, if you look at just the trajectory of social justice movements, the individual expansion of rights, the expansion of the sense of fairness and justice is expanding over the past 200 years and accelerating in many ways. You see around gay rights in America, it's a really great example. I think many people think gay rights is the civil rights movement of our time. And over the past 15 years, such incredible rapidity of solidarity, of empathy, of a sense of sort of shared consciousness, where you have this, I think, overwhelming support now, especially young people, about gay rights. And that shows that people, when they're shared storytelling and shared information about how people live their lives, there tends to be greater empathy and solidarity.
So let me ask you the grubby question. How do you keep the doors open on this thing? What's the finance?
My mom asked me this all the time.
Yes, I speak on behalf of the entire media here, saying, what is the financial model that works, that allows you to keep this going?
Yeah, so we have an advertising platform that allows nonprofits to connect to people who care about the issues they work on. And so it's a sort of sponsored petitions similar to sponsored videos on YouTube, sponsored tweets on Twitter. And so if someone comes onto the site and cares about, let's say, environmental sustainability, the Sierra Club might be featured as a sponsored petition they can join. And so they pay for advertising that way.
And that is enough to keep it, how big a staff?
It's 150 staff around the world.
Wow.
And we have 20 million members.
That's a lot of sponsored petition campaigns.
It's a lot of sponsored petitions. It's all about scale. Right? The internet's all about massive scale. The number of people we should be able to mobilize is an order of magnitude more than almost any organization should be able to previously. And it's not because we're better, it's because these sort of exponential returns, the exponential growth of the internet. And that's just amazing, and the capacity for sort of the world historical change is greater now because of that facility, that rapid expansion. And because of that, we have more members that are able to generate more revenue.
We were talking about this a little bit last night on a panel. We are heading toward, if we have not passed, $1 billion spent on television advertising in this presidential campaign. And most of it going to 9 states and 6% of the population. I mean, you're at the point where it would have been cheaper to buy every undecided voter in Ohio a television at this point. But hi, I'm Mitt Romney. I'm here with your 40-inch plasma. I would appreciate your consideration.
It's a great strategy, actually.
Yeah, it probably would be. But I'm just interested in your thought about, you mentioned politicians and you were talking about Congress in responding. What about the way that, do you think the balance of the way that we communicate in the race for president, which is kind of, along with the Super Bowl, one of our big civic activities that involve everybody in the country. Do you think the balance is going to shift? And ultimately, is it more effective to try to reach people as individuals online, or do you still see this kind of carpet bombing television approach dominating going out into the future?
Yeah,
2024.
One of the most exciting things I see, maybe 2028, I think one of the exciting things I see is that disruption where politicians don't care about money per se, they care about votes. And the means by which to get votes is to advertise massively or to expose a message to many people in a convincing manner. Now, fundamentally, if you get enough people to do that on your behalf, it's as valuable, if not more so. So $1 billion seems like a lot of money, but if you can aggregate the value of peer-to-peer connections of 300 million people talking amongst each other about candidates and the support, the value there is much, much greater. And so I think as you have a disaggregation of centralized media and the capacity for people, basically receiving information through channels of friends instead of mainstream broadcasts, you're going to undermine the value of every different dollar and increase the value of personal relationships. Now, it's not going to happen tomorrow, may not happen in 4 years, but that's where we're headed, where sort of peer-to-peer communication, facilitated content through those networks is going to be much more influential than $1 billion might be.
Yeah, that's a horizontal communication as opposed to kind of the vertical coming down, the track. Money goes from all over the country into the campaign headquarters, is processed and comes back out as television ads. Yep. Kind of that kind of triangle almost, but a vertical form of communication. You're talking about mobilizing people to communicate in a horizontal way across the networks of their own acquaintances. And certainly there's a lot more money and effort going into that in each successive campaign by the candidates, but they're still betting the most heavily on kind of the old tool.
Overwhelmingly, and I think we're just in the earliest stages. It used to be the case you have a specific opinion and you propagate that to an audience of people that are circumscribed by geographic proximity. Now almost any act you take, at least certainly in younger generations, is propagated across a friend network via Twitter or Facebook. And as you have that increased information spread, I mean, most of my friends, and certainly my younger brother's friends, are consuming content through Facebook, right, and through Twitter. And that content isn't just produced by mainstream media, it's produced by themselves and friends of theirs. And so that content consumption, as it increases amongst horizontally friends and friends of friends, you end up having that sort of, I think, destabilizes the traditional top-down communication mechanism and undermines the value of an incremental dollar for any campaign and increases the value of convincing people to propagate your message.
To your point, with my younger son, I'm watching my younger son and the way he consumes media, I was thinking that a great investment for Obama would be to invest in ads in surf videos. So, but I want to ask you one last thing and then bring in the audience. To what extent, though, is all of this the preserve of kind of an upper middle class, educated, college plus kind of slice of society? Is what's happening here truly engaging all Americans, or is this ultimately a way in which one slice is finding more like-minded folks, but not really reaching beyond their slice?
This is one of the things we're most excited about and frankly surprised about to some extent, is it's empowering the least powerful in many cases. The biggest differentiation are those that didn't have any voice. And the two, I think, most consistent examples we see on the site, one is foreclosures. It's a huge number of campaigns, not a national campaign around foreclosures, but local campaigns, thousands of them, of people that are kicked out of their homes are going to be because they cannot even reach their loan officer at a bank. And by starting a petition, embarrassing oftentimes the local bank, they're able to get media awareness and stay in their homes. And so these are people that are, in many cases, the most downtrodden. And the second is this case around immigration, and people that actually aren't even legal in this country, legally sort of documented in this country, who are now able to start campaigns on their own behalf or on the behalf of their friends and get them to stop from being deported.
And of course, this is going to button up a point we were talking about before. Ultimately, you are not going to be able to launch petition campaigns on behalf of the millions of people facing foreclosure. That is the kind of issue that ultimately has to be dealt with by some kind of policy if it's going to be dealt with at all. But your view is that you're basically building awareness case by case that ultimately translates into support for more systemic action?
Yep. When people recognize that foreclosure is not about those people, these people who are irresponsible, who should have known better, but actually see the intimate insight into real people who are directly impacted, and clearly in some cases very unjust circumstances, who become this very large public narrative, chipping away at the false suspicion that they're just irresponsible homeowners.
All right, let's bring in some questions from the audience. I think we have one right over here. If you could identify yourself when you ask your question.
My name is Barry Jagoda. I'm wondering what restrictions you may place on these petition campaigns. What about the problem of vigilantism? Or to give you a specific example, let's say a couple of us decided that Diane Sawyer was ruining ABC News because she'd moved to tabloid journalism. Is that the kind of campaign you would accept?
So we don't filter at all any campaign. So just like YouTube, anybody can post a video. Anybody can start a petition. And what you tend to find is the kind of petitions that expand, especially those that expand virally, resonate in a fairly deep way with a large group of people and tend not to be the kind of divisive, let's say hateful, or just things that you might be very skeptical of. And so it is the case that in some situations there'll be petitions that are dubious or people are concerned about, but they're flagged almost always by the community. They are oftentimes removed. But overwhelmingly, the kind of campaigns that get started, and especially that expand and win, are those that are sort of positive social change that many people agree with.
Let's see, in the front here? Hold on. You need the mic. Just identify yourself, please.
I'm Danielle Weiss. I'm a physician. I actually haven't gone on your website, but it sounds amazing, and I love the dialogue. And I'm just curious how this interacts with the international community, and also for maybe the someone like myself. I'm just curious about what the overall picture is. Do you map it out in terms of what are the hot topics and make it a real dialogue?
So right now, we just hired in about 15 countries, a lot in Asia, Latin America in particular, and all Western Europe. And what's exciting is more than 1 million new members a month that are joining the site. And you end up having, in countries that previously didn't have lots of online activity and organizing at all, India and the Philippines are great examples, immense numbers of victories. In India, in particular, around the issue of corruption, where instead of large national campaigns around corruption, it's individual officers who are requesting bribes being exposed now through petitions and getting censured. And so I think the international stuff for us is one of the most exciting because the sort of magnitude of needed improvement of justice is in many ways much greater than we even have in the United States.
Do you capture information about the people who sign the petitions, emails or?
Capture email information and sort of most postcode or zip code, and then we're able to target people.
I was going to ask you, then can you go back and people who've signed environmental petitions, do you sell or make available that information to somebody else who wants to do an environmental petition?
We do is we then personalize the experience in the same way you might for Amazon, but oftentimes via email alerts. And so based on someone's interests, what they take action on, and based on response rates, we personalize recommendations for additional campaigns.
But can the campaigns buy that from you? No.
So people can pay to sponsor campaigns on the site. You don't get direct, you don't sort of send emails based on that. It's sort of featured on the site as a sponsored petition in the same way as a sponsored tweet might be in Twitter.
But you'll do like kind of the Amazon thing. You know, we've seen you sign 4 petitions on recycling. Here's one that might be of interest to you.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And what's the do you have like kind of, have you discovered a class of people who are kind of like habitual, you know, like who is your like all time? You have someone who's signed, you know, the most petitions?
Oh, I mean, thousands, literally. Some people have signed almost every petition. But the people that are most, it's crazy. I don't know what they have, but what's notable is the increase in amenability, the sort of increase in likelihood of signing petitions after experiencing a victory. You know, there's a lot of skepticism about the impact of petitions, and totally understandably so. And the reason is, historically, there hasn't been a lot of demonstrated impact. And the reason is these very large sort of movements around, you know, getting President Obama to stop climate change. Very difficult to do directly. But you have these local victories on a regular basis that are inspiring people to recognize they have the capacity to make a difference in ways they didn't suspect before.
There must have been petitions about issues that people wanted to be raised in the first presidential debate. I assume there were a whole bunch of those?
There are a lot of, yes, there are actually a lot of those, but mostly the petitions are related to things like incremental change people can win. So as the presidential elections continue to unfold, there are all these campaigns that are winning and running, sort of even in Congress. This bill around enterprise, there's a recent bill around sort of military veterans and having sort of clean water and a bunch of military bases. So it's sort of in the undercurrent. This isn't covered by the media in many cases. It's less sexy, but things are happening, change is happening at a local level or small specific campaigns almost every day.
Okay, let's see, another question in the back middle, and then we'll come up here. Yeah.
Hey, you're mentioning about your early days seemed inspiring. Could you elaborate on those first 2 or 3 years? How did you get from idea through all that period of failure to finally success? How did you finance that, and how big was your team, and how did that go?
Yeah, it's a great question. I was depressed. So we started the organization with a good friend of mine from Stanford, and he was a tech guy doing everything, and I was the sort of the ideas guy telling him all the things to do, and it was a lot easier of a job. So it was just the two of us. And we had one other guy named, he was from Northwestern, a friend of ours. And so 3 of us for the first 3 years. And what you do in consumer internet companies is you massively iterate. You sort of launch a certain product, you see the response by the public, you see the incremental sort of numbers on Google Analytics, and then you change and shift and build additional features. And we built almost everything, right? Virtual political action committees, skills-based volunteerism, social fundraising, and almost none of it worked. And so it was only after sort of peeling back a lot of those different features that we realized what would really work with petitions. But the most important determining factor for success, and this is the case for almost any venture, especially online, is a relentless determination. Right? It's actually this accelerator program called Y Combinator, and a very famous guy who runs it says, by far, looking across all the different websites they fund, Airbnb, and this is Box and whatnot, very large consumer internet sites, the most important determining factor of the success of a team is the relentless determination of founders to do whatever is necessary to succeed. And that's what we did. We just never, ever give up.
Up here in the front.
Hi, Nancy Sattel-Weiss. I have a quick high-tech question for you concerning Relentless and petitions. Every time I go to a supermarket or Trader Joe's or Target, there is always someone with a cause and a petition, and sometimes I'm interested, sometimes I don't have the time. Have you thought of coming up with an app so that when you walk out, you say, at least you can say, all right, I'll check your app.
Absolutely.
Just to avoid confrontation or having to say, no, I don't have time, or that kind of negative interaction.
Yeah, so our goal is to reduce the barriers of civic participation as much as possible. And one big part of this is mobile. We've just hired a large number of engineers to help work on this. And so not only will it be the case that people can, on an iPad, sign a petition, you can walk into, let's say, Target, and you can automatically see sort of geolocation that you're in Target, any campaigns that are targeting the company at that certain time, things that, supply chain management or issues around, policies around worker rights that you'll be able to join immediately in real time based on where you're at.
Anything, I got some in the middle. No, I'll give somebody a chance on that side. Go ahead.
Yeah, hi, Fred Powell. The disaggregation of information delivery and the idea that it's spreading it out applies to the other 2 themes of the conference here, energy and medicine. The Affordable Care Act is being challenged because that represents a disaggregation of providing those services. Solar energy, we have a massive delivery system because of the paradigm that someone's going to control generation. Whose toes are you stepping on when you're trying to disaggregate information delivery?
There's almost nobody whose toes we don't step on or people through the site do. I mean, you have this sort of status quo, and all the campaigns, when they're advancing change, are going to be either offending or undermining the existing power structure of some entity. And so the question for us is, how do you change incentives, or how do you make it painful enough for people and stepping on their toes to want to change and move them back? And so inevitably, we don't aim to be confrontational because we want to be antagonistic. We aim for sort of building power, but people everywhere in a disaggregated way as a means of changing things. There's always entrenched interests that you're fighting. Although I will say one thing, which is on the corporate side in particular, you end up seeing companies who, this is a great example around Jamba Juice. Jamba Juice, it's a company, it's styrofoam cups, and there's a young girl who starts a petition who's a big fan of Jamba Juice. Who says, look, I love Jamba Juice, but I hate styrofoam, and I want you to commit to having compostable cups. And huge campaign, 170,000 people, I think, join. Certainly in some ways, it frustrates Jamba Juice, but there's certainly some people at Jamba Juice and stakeholders around that company that are glad there's now the impetus from the ground up to encourage them to do what many people, frankly, in the company already wanted them to do. So it's not purely antagonistic. It actually gives them now the agency to go to shareholders and the public and sort of make this commitment. That might be expensive, but they can justify based upon citizen or customer pressure.
Do you think, I was thinking about, the kind of for brands, especially with kind of a youth audience that they're trying to reach, you can see how they would be very receptive to visible changes. Do you think this platform could convince Apple to drop Foxconn?
It's a huge campaign, actually, around this issue.
Right.
In direct response to the NPR, now somewhat dubious coverage of the kind of the workers' rights in Foxconn. It's notable. So a campaign started from a Virginia man, ends up getting a huge fan of Apple. More than 200,000 people joined. There's protests in 4 continents around this, very distributed. And though it was revealed that some of the information was dubious, the general underlying idea of lack of good pay and sort of harsh physical conditions was true. And a few weeks after that, Apple announces a substantial increase in hourly wages. And it was certainly not the only reason it happened, but there's some material reason. And I think what you have is the increased transparency of the supply chain of the actions of almost any company. It used to be the case that you could sit around a boardroom and be pretty confident that most of the decisions you made were in obscurity, and the things you were doing that might undermine the rights of people in countries that most people have never been to or don't even know about were sort of oblivious to most of your customers. And so it's now the case that when you're sitting around a boardroom, you have to assume 2 things. One is that almost any decision you make is going to be transparent. And immediately in rapid response to exposing that, there's going to be a lobbying group of customers that will fight you toe-to-toe in a very public way. And so it doesn't mean you change every decision, but it does mean you have to recognize that if you can't justify it in public, it's very difficult to sustain.
A different answer to your question is that, historically, the power to set the dialogue, to decide what the society heard and talked about, was controlled by a relatively few number of people, whether in kind of the television, the mass media, or politicians, or anybody else who had a public platform to kind of shape the dialogue. And what we have now is the capacity for mass communication without the mass media that is moving, first of all, outside of the big media institutions toward big players like the campaigns themselves, and now moving through medium like this toward individuals. I mean, the idea that an individual could speak to 100,000 people, who could do that before? It was the owner of the local newspaper had the ability to do that, and nobody else. So that's the disruption and the disintermediation that's going on. The ability to talk to large numbers of people and kind of get an idea in front of them is really radically democratizing. We have a question all the way up at the top.
Hi. I want to follow up with your question about Foxconn. It seems to me that there's a dichotomy that exists, and that is that in those plants that you're talking about, people are working perhaps their first important job in their life, and they're sustaining themselves through the wages they make. In addition, McDonald's in Africa. I also question why is McDonald's in Africa, but I hear from Africans that McDonald's is the only nutritious, clean meal they can get. So while we need to change practices, I agree, we may not want to go so far as to stop Apple from working with Foxconn.
I think a totally valid point. So we don't actually take any official position on issues like this. We're a platform that empowers people to advance the change that they seek. But it's notable, I think one of the things that we encourage companies especially to do is to engage in public dialogue. You know, Mayor Bloomberg recently made a comment about the difficulty of governing in a context of social media where in every single situation there's a mass audience that are mobilizing against decisions he makes. And my response is, but it's not like we're sort of decision-making body. We're an accountability demanding body of sort of citizens around the world. And so it doesn't mean that you have to change policy. Apple doesn't have to change, but it has to explain and make a public argument for why that's the case.
But isn't the challenge, I mean, as I was trying to get at this before, that the ability to organize does not really change the distribution of opinion. It just kind of allows it to be more focused and presented in kind of as more of a phalanx. And ultimately, the challenge on so many of the issues we face is finding a consensus, some sort of working consensus for change that goes beyond your tribe. I mean, part of the challenge here is that you're making it easier for each tribe to organize and be heard and to amplify, in your word, its voice. Does that get you closer or further away from coming to accommodation with at least some portion of the other tribe who is also there?
It's a great question. I'll give you an example. And again, most issues, not the ones we talk about at a national level, but most issues are actually not all that divisive. So a quick example around corporate accountability. So right now, one of the most exploitative industries in the world is the flower picking industry. And the reason is a massive chemical exposure to flower pickers. A double-digit percentage of females who are pregnant, women who are pregnant while picking flowers, have deformed babies. And so this isn't something most people want. If most people knew about this and had the capacity to mobilize around it, they'd recognize this is the wrong thing to do. Fair trade is the sort of necessary next step. And there's a campaign that a woman started asking 1-800-Flowers to accept fair trade flowers for the first time. And this explodes, 50,000 people join, ends up embarrassing 1-800-Flowers. And 24 hours after, they make a 180-degree turn and accept fair trade for the first time. And even people that were at 1-800-Flowers, I bet you cared about that as well and recognized that was the right thing to do. But because of shareholder sort of profit maximization, because of supply chain management, everyone else did the same thing. They sort of dismissed it as an issue they wouldn't address. So I think there's so many examples, so many more examples of that. But really there is
But what
solidarity.
Bloomberg is talking about, though, is governing decisions and the ability to organize in opposition to whatever it is. And what this does, this tend to amplify the loudest, most passionate voices. I mean, can you imagine a petition doing well? Maybe it will. Can you imagine a petition urging whoever wins in November to compromise with the other party to deal with the deficit and the fiscal cliff?
Well, I'm sure there's going to be a petition, but it probably wouldn't take off.
Right.
And the reason is these are things that people, it's certainly there's a personal, emotional component to many of these things. But I will note that if it is the case that there's a minority of people that are mobilizing around certain issues, this is in part a reflection of the desire for minorities who don't have equal rights in some cases to be able to represent their voice. The issue around immigration is a great example. And so sort of empowering the least powerful is in many ways the most important thing we could do.
Well, Ben, this has been a great conversation. Would you join me in thanking Ben